They say weddings are supposed to be a celebration of love, unity, and family. But sometimes, weddings reveal more about people's true hearts than any other day. The hall was breathtaking. Towering chandeliers spilling golden light across the polished marble floors, silk-draped tables sparkling with crystal glasses, and a sea of guests dressed in designer suits and glittering gowns. It was the kind of wedding that made headlines, where every corner whispered of wealth, status, and prestige. And at the center of it all was Sophia, the bride. At 27, she looked radiant, her eyes warm, her smile full of hope, as she clutched the hand of her new husband, Daniel. She believed this was the happiest day of her life, the start of a future built on love. But behind that smile stood her mother, Margaret, 52 years old, dressed not in diamonds or couture but in a modest navy blue gown. Her silver earrings caught the light, but they weren't extravagant, just simple and dignified, much like the woman herself. To the guests who cared about appearances, she didn't belong. While the hall shimmered with opulence, Margaret blended quietly into the background, watching her daughter with love in her eyes. And yet, as the music swelled and laughter echoed through the hall, the whispers began. "Is that really the mother of the bride?" one woman murmured behind a jeweled fan. "She couldn't even afford a proper gown," another whispered, her voice sharp with judgment. "And the gift? Did you see the size of that box? Pathetic." The words floated through the air like poisoned arrows reaching Margaret's ears. But she didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands folded gently in front of her. Because Margaret carried a secret so big that, if revealed, it could silence the room in an instant. But for now, she chose silence. For now, she wanted to see something. She wanted to know if Daniel, the man who promised to love her daughter, would see beyond appearances. Unfortunately, Daniel was about to answer that question in the cruelest way. The reception began, glasses clinking as toasts were made. Sophia's cheeks glowed with joy, while Daniel's smile shone a little too wide, practiced, rehearsed, as if he were performing for an audience. When it came time for Margaret to step forward with her gift, she moved slowly but gracefully. It was a simple box, wrapped neatly, tied with a ribbon. Inside was something deeply personal, meaningful, a necklace Sophia's grandmother had once worn, passed down through the family as a symbol of love and resilience. But Daniel never cared for sentiment. As Margaret placed the gift in Sophia's hands, Daniel let out a laugh. A laugh that cut through the music, silencing conversations around the room. "Really?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Is this what you bring to your only daughter's wedding? A hand-me-down trinket? My God, I'm married into a family of beggars." The room froze. Glasses stopped midair, forks clinked against plates. All eyes turned to Margaret, standing there, her face calm, but her eyes glistening with quiet pain. Sophia gasped, her lips parting to protest, but Daniel's hand tightened around hers under the table, warning her to stay silent. She looked at her mother helplessly, torn between her love for Margaret and the man she had just vowed to spend her life with. The guests shifted uncomfortably. Some chuckled under their breath, others simply shook their heads, relishing the drama. Daniel's wealthy relatives smirked, clearly enjoying the spectacle. But Margaret, she didn't shout. She didn't break down. Instead, she straightened her back, lifted her chin, and said softly, "True gifts are not measured by their price tags, Daniel. One day, you'll understand." Her voice was steady, but her heart ached. Not for herself, but for Sophia. For the life her daughter was about to step into. Now, if you've ever been in a room where respect is stripped away from someone undeserving of such treatment, you know the feeling. The secondhand sting, the tension that makes your chest tighten. That was the atmosphere in that hall. Margaret had been tested, humiliated, ridiculed in front of hundreds. And yet, she endured with dignity. But what no one in that room knew, not Daniel, not the snickering relatives, not the gossiping elites, was that Margaret wasn't the woman they thought she was. She wasn't just a modest mother from humble means. She wasn't powerless. She wasn't poor. She was watching, testing, measuring. And soon, her silence would shatter everything. Daniel, of course, thought he had won. He leaned back in his chair, smug, basking in the admiration of those who mistook arrogance for strength. He thought humiliating his mother-in-law made him appear powerful. But the truth about power is this: it never announces itself with cruelty. It waits patiently until the right moment. And that moment was closer than anyone expected. Because just as Daniel raised his glass to toast his own pride, the heavy wooden doors at the far end of the hall creaked open. The music faltered, the laughter died, heads turned, eyes widening. And there, stepping into the golden light of the reception hall, was a man who carried the kind of presence that made the air itself feel heavier. Tall, dignified, with sharp eyes that seemed to pierce straight through lies and vanity. His very arrival drew whispers of awe. Guests began to murmur his name under their breath. It was Mr. Harrison, the CEO of Daniel's company, the man Daniel worshipped. The man Daniel had spent years trying to impress. Daniel's smug expression cracked, panic flashing briefly in his eyes before he forced a smile. He leapt to his feet, straightening his suit, hurrying forward to greet the powerful man. The guests exchanged curious glances. Why was the CEO here? Why now? And why did his eyes seem fixed, not on Daniel, but on Margaret? And as the doors closed behind him and silence blanketed the room, one thing was clear. This wedding was about to change forever. Because when Mr. Harrison walked into a room, silence always followed. At 60, he carried himself like a man who had spent decades bending the world to his will. Broad-shouldered, sharp-eyed, and impeccably dressed in a tailored black suit, he had the kind of presence that demanded respect without a single word. His reputation preceded him. Everyone in that hall knew his name. Harrison wasn't just a CEO. He was a legend in the business world, a man whose handshake could change the course of entire industries. And for Daniel, this was a dream come true. His jaw dropped for only a moment before snapping into a polished smile. He hurried forward, his hands outstretched, his voice practically shaking with excitement. "Mr. Harrison, what an honor! You came, ladies and gentlemen," Daniel announced proudly, puffing up his chest. "This is my boss, the great Mr. Harrison himself. The man I've had the privilege to work under." The guests erupted into murmurs of awe and admiration. "Can you believe it?" someone whispered. "The CEO came to Daniel's wedding." "This proves Daniel is really moving up in the world," another said. Daniel basked in their approval, soaking in every nod and every admiring glance. To him, this was confirmation that he had secured his place among the powerful. But as Harrison's eyes swept across the glittering hall, his expression didn't soften. He gave Daniel a polite nod, nothing more, cold, almost dismissive, and then his gaze shifted, straight to Margaret. Now imagine being in that room. Daniel was still boasting, gesturing wildly as if he'd brought royalty into the party, but Harrison wasn't listening. He was walking, slow, deliberate steps past the bride, past the groom, past the glittering guests. His sharp eyes never left Margaret. The crowd stilled. Confusion rippled through the room. Why was he ignoring Daniel? Daniel's smile faltered. He turned quickly, trying to mask his panic, but it was too late. Harrison was already standing before Margaret. And then it happened, something that shocked everyone to their core. "Margaret," Harrison said warmly with a smile reserved for trusted friends. "It's been far too long." The room gasped, the whispers came like a storm. "Wait, he knows her? Impossible. She's nobody." Why would the Harrison, know the bride's mother? Daniel's face drained of color. He blinked rapidly, as if trying to make sense of what he'd just heard. Margaret, calm as ever, rose slowly to her feet. Her eyes softened at Harrison's words, but her lips curved into only the faintest smile. "Good evening, Mr. Harrison. What a surprise to see you here." Her voice was measured, almost downplaying the connection. But it was too late. The damage had been done. The powerful CEO hadn't acknowledged Daniel. He hadn't congratulated the bride. He had gone straight to Margaret. And everyone noticed. Daniel forced a laugh, trying to recover. "Ah, yes, my mother-in-law. She's quite something, isn't she?" But his words sounded hollow, weak. Because Harrison wasn't looking at Daniel anymore. His hand rested gently on Margaret's shoulder, and in that gesture alone, there was familiarity. Respect. Sophia, watching from the head table, furrowed her brows. She had never seen her mother with this man before, never heard her speak of him. Yet the way they stood together like old allies made her heart pound with questions. Could it be? Had her mother been hiding something all along? The dinner continued, though the air was thick with tension. When Harrison finally took a seat, Daniel scrambled to place him near the front, as close to the bridal table as possible. Anything to salvage his image. Glasses were filled, candles flickered, and a toast was called. Harrison rose slowly, his presence commanding silence once again. He lifted his glass, but before speaking, his eyes flicked briefly to Margaret, a knowing glance, a silent exchange, and then his voice rang out. Tonight, we celebrate love. But love, true love, is not about wealth or appearances. It is not measured by the size of gifts, nor the shine of gold. Real wealth is measured by character. The words struck the room like a thunderclap. Some nodded, touched by the sentiment, others whispered, confused. Daniel forced another laugh, leaning toward his relatives. He's just being polite, he whispered harshly, trying to give my mother-in-law some dignity. Nothing more. But his voice wavered, because deep down, Daniel knew. Harrison wasn't the kind of man to waste words. Sophia sat quietly, her hand tightening around the stem of her glass. Something about this didn't feel right. Her mother, who lived such a simple life, who never flaunted riches or power. Why did the most respected man in Daniel's world speak as though he knew her intimately? Margaret noticed her daughter's unease. Across the table, she gave Sophia a small, reassuring smile, a silent message, trust me. Not yet, but Sophia's heart was unsettled. She wanted to ask, she wanted answers. Meanwhile, Daniel's arrogance began to crack. He laughed too loudly, spoke too quickly, desperate to draw attention back to himself. But every time Harrison's eyes flicked toward Margaret, every time the CEO spoke of values and true wealth, Daniel's skin prickled with unease. And then came the moment that would shatter the thin facade Daniel had built. Harrison set his glass down, his eyes scanning the room with the weight of someone about to deliver a revelation. The guests leaned forward, eager, sensing the shift in tone. And then, with a calm voice that carried across the entire hall, he said, "Tonight, we do not just honor a marriage. We honor the daughter of the most powerful woman I've ever had the privilege to work for." Gasps filled the room. Forks clattered against plates. The chandeliers themselves seemed to tremble with the weight of his words. All eyes snapped to Margaret. She sat there, calm, her hands folded neatly in her lap. Not denying, not confirming, just letting the silence do the work. Sophia's eyes widened, her heart racing with confusion. Daniel, however, turned as pale as the linens on the tables, because in that single sentence his world began to crumble. What secret had he missed? What truth had his arrogance blinded him from? And what power did his so-called beggar mother-in-law truly hold? The wedding hall was frozen in stunned silence. The air itself seemed to hold its breath after Harrison's words. 100 pairs of eyes shifted from him to Margaret, the woman who had been whispered about all evening as the beggar mother, and now revealed as something no one could have imagined. But Harrison wasn't done. He stepped forward, his voice steady, commanding the room. "You all should know the truth. The woman you dismissed, mocked, and ignored, she is not what you thought she was. Margaret built an empire from the ground up, and the company Daniel works for, my company, is in fact her company. I may be CEO, but she is the owner, the true power behind it all." Gasps rippled across the hall like waves breaking on shore. Fans fluttered nervously. Champagne glasses trembled in people's hands. Some guests even stood, craning their necks for a clearer view of Margaret, as though seeing her for the first time. Margaret did not flinch. She remained seated, her posture straight, her hands calm in her lap. But her eyes, those warm brown eyes that carried both steel and sorrow, lifted to meet the gaze of her daughter, Sophia. And it was then that the story began to spill out. Harrison continued, his voice now laced with reverence. Many years ago, Margaret had nothing. No wealth, no titles, no helping hand to lean on. She started with a single idea, a single spark of determination, and turned it into a flame that lit an empire. While others were chasing comfort, she was working through sleepless nights. While others mocked her ambition, she built connections, negotiated deals, and forged her own path. The room blurred into silence, and in that silence, it was as if the walls themselves bent time, pulling everyone into Margaret's past. I could almost see her there. A much younger Margaret, carrying boxes down a narrow street, her clothes worn but her spirit unbroken. Nights in small rented rooms, scribbling numbers into ledgers by the dim glow of a single bulb. Days filled with rejection after rejection, until finally, her ideas found traction. Every sacrifice etched lines of resilience into her soul. Every loss taught her a lesson she wielded like armor. And through all of it, she made a choice. A choice most could never understand. She chose, Harrison explained, to live modestly, to remain grounded, to stay away from the parasites of society who orbit wealth like moths around a flame. Margaret wanted to protect herself and her daughter from people who value money more than love, status more than sincerity. All eyes swung back to Sophia. The bride was trembling, tears brimming in her eyes, her lips parting as the realization crashed over her. Her mother, her quiet, unassuming mother, hadn't been embarrassed by poverty. She had chosen her life, chosen humility, chosen sacrifice. Sophia's heart cracked open. The shame she had felt earlier when Daniel's family mocked her mother now transformed into something far heavier: regret. Margaret had hidden her empire, not to punish, but to protect. To see if any man would love Sophia for Sophia, not for the fortune she would one day inherit. The whispers in the hall grew sharper, cutting the air. Owner of the company? All this time? She let him call her a beggar? And then, as though the floor itself had been pulled from beneath him, Daniel realized the gravity of his mistake. His face, once smug and condescending, was now pale. Sweat dotted his forehead. He glanced around wildly, searching for an escape, but the walls of shame were closing in. Still, he tried. Margaret? Daniel stammered, forcing a strained smile. I had no idea. If I'd known, of course, I would have treated you differently. You have to understand, I didn't mean the things I said earlier. They were just jokes, misunderstandings. But the hall did not forget. His earlier insults hung heavy in the air, replaying in the minds of every guest. Beggar. Embarrassment. Dead weight. And Margaret? She finally rose to her feet. The room stilled again. Her dress, simple yet dignified, rustled softly as she moved. Her face was calm, but her voice, when it came, carried the weight of years of silence breaking at last. I stayed silent, Daniel, she said, her eyes boring into him. Silent to see who you truly were. Tonight, you revealed yourself, and no fortune in the world can disguise the truth of a man's character. The words struck harder than any slap. Daniel's facade cracked, his jaw trembling as the truth clawed at him. Sophia sobbed openly now, covering her face with her hands. Mother, you sacrificed everything, and I was blind to the love behind your silence. Margaret reached for her daughter, her touch gentle but firm, her voice tender. No, Sophia, you were not blind, you were hopeful. You wanted love as I wanted for you. But hope is fragile, and tonight, it broke. The guests shifted, uncomfortable yet unable to look away. What they were witnessing was no longer just a wedding, it was the unmasking of greed, the triumph of truth, the heartbreak of betrayal. Daniel, desperate now, tried once more. Please, Sophia, listen to me. None of this matters. I love you. That's all that should count. But even his words rang hollow. And then came the final blow. Harrison, who had been watching in silence as the truth unfolded, stepped forward again. His expression was stern, almost merciless. Daniel, he said, his voice sharp enough to slice through the air, you're not just marrying into wealth, you're working for it. And the woman you just insulted is not only your mother-in-law, she is your employer. From this day forward, every paycheck you earn has her name on it. The hall erupted in shock, some guests gasping aloud, others whispering feverishly. Daniel's knees seemed to buckle as the words settled on him like iron chains. Sophia froze, her tears suspended, as though even her grief was stunned into silence. And Margaret? She remained standing, her eyes never leaving Daniel's face, her silence more damning than any speech could ever be. The wedding hall was no longer a celebration. It had become a courtroom, and Daniel was already convicted. But just as the air reached its breaking point, with the weight of the revelation pressing on every chest in the room, something else stirred at the edges of the hall. A shadow, a movement, a presence that promised this night's unraveling was far from over, because what none of them yet knew was that another secret, even darker, was about to surface. And that secret would change everything. The room had gone quiet. The laughter, the whispers, the clinking of champagne glasses, all of it had dissolved into a heavy silence. A silence so thick you could almost hear the weight of truth pressing down on everyone. Daniel stood in the middle of the wedding hall, his face pale, his hands trembling, sweat dripping down his temple, as the truth of who I really was, his so-called beggar mother-in-law, echoed in every corner of the room. I was no beggar. I was the woman who owned the very empire he worked under. The same empire he thought he could climb through manipulation, charm, and lies. And now, everyone knew. But instead of bowing his head in shame, Daniel straightened his tie, forcing a pitiful smile, and walked toward me. "Margaret," he said, his voice cracking but still trying to hold on to that old arrogant confidence. I didn't know. I didn't mean those things I said. I was wrong. You must understand, I was under stress. I didn't know who you were. But now," he swallowed hard, his eyes darting between me and the crowd, "now I see everything clearly. Please, forgive me. We can start over." His words floated into the silence, but they were hollow, emptier than a broken promise. I could see it in his eyes. This wasn't love. This wasn't remorse. It was desperation. Before I could respond, Sophia, my daughter, stood up. Her wedding gown shimmered under the chandelier lights, but her face was pale, her eyes glassy. I could see her heart breaking, yet in that moment, I also saw a fire ignite in her, a strength she had inherited long before she ever knew it. She looked Daniel in the eyes, her voice trembling at first, then growing steadier with every word. "You never loved me, Daniel." The crowd gasped. "You only loved what you thought you could gain from me. The status, the wealth, the power, everything but me." Her words sliced through the hall like a blade. I saw Daniel flinch, his charm crumbling like a mask ripped away. Sophia's voice cracked, but she did not falter. "I gave you my heart, and all you gave me was lies." The weight of her words broke the last remaining illusion. Some guests turned their heads in shame, others shook their heads in disgust. Daniel reached for her hand, his lips trembling. "Sophia, no, please, you don't understand. I did love you. I still love you." But she stepped back. "No," she whispered, her voice clear enough for everyone to hear. "You loved the empire, the name, the inheritance, but you never once loved me." The hall felt like a battlefield now, truth against pride, betrayal against dignity. I stepped forward, wrapping my arm around Sophia, pulling her close. I felt her shoulders shaking, her heart racing. And in that moment, I knew what I had to do as a mother. "My darling," I whispered so only she could hear. "Love built on lies will never last. Better a heart that breaks once than a soul chained forever." Her tears spilled, but she nodded, and I could feel her strength rising. Then, Harrison, the CEO, my loyal friend and the man who had helped orchestrate this test, stepped forward. His voice boomed, calm but commanding. "Daniel's true character has been revealed tonight. And let me be clear. He has disqualified himself from any claim to Margaret's empire. He has no place among us, not in business, not in family." The guests murmured in agreement. The same people who once whispered behind my back calling me a beggar now looked at me with newfound respect. I could feel the tide turning, judgment melting into admiration. And then Sophia did something I didn't expect. She lifted her chin, wiped her tears, and looked Daniel straight in the eyes. "This marriage," she said, her voice firm and steady, "ends before it begins." The room erupted in shock. The priest dropped his book. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sophia continued, unwavering. "I will not chain myself to a man who deceives, who manipulates, who treats love as a transaction. Daniel, whatever this was, it's over." Daniel's face crumpled. His lips quivered, but no sound came out. He had been stripped bare before the world, not just of his lies, but of the very thing he thought he had mastered, control. Sophia turned away from him, her steps strong, her gown sweeping like a queen, reclaiming her throne. The hall was silent again, but this time, it wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Everyone waited for what I would do next. I stepped forward, my heart pounding but my spirit calm. For years I had hidden my identity, waiting for this moment, not just to protect my empire, but to test the hearts of those who might one day inherit it. And now, the choice was clear. I raised my voice, letting it echo through every corner of the hall. I did not spend my life building an empire just to hand it to a man unworthy of it. Tonight has proven something greater than I ever imagined. I don't need a son-in-law to carry my legacy. I turned, my eyes locking on Sophia, her face still streaked with tears but glowing with strength. Because my daughter is more than strong enough to carry it herself. Gasps, then applause. The guests who once mocked me now rose to their feet, clapping, cheering, celebrating not just me but Sophia. She froze, her lips parting, eyes wide in disbelief. "Mother, me?" I smiled, taking her hands. "You don't need a man's name to define you. You are my heir, my pride, and the future of everything I built." Tears streamed down her face, but they weren't tears of sorrow anymore. They were tears of triumph. The applause grew louder. The hall erupted in cheers. Sophia stood tall, not as a bride abandoned, but as a woman reborn, an heiress, a leader, and a daughter who had found her true worth. Daniel slunk away, his head bowed, his shame too heavy to carry. He had lost not just the empire, but the respect of everyone in that hall. And as I stood beside Sophia, watching her accept the cheers, I knew this story had ended not in tragedy, but in triumph. A mother's wisdom, a daughter's strength, and a legacy preserved, not through marriage, but through courage. And that, my dear listeners, is how the beggar became the queenmaker. If this story moved you, if it made you think about love, pride, and the strength we sometimes don't even know we carry, then I invite you to join me here on this channel, where we share stories that inspire, shock, and remind us of the power of truth. Don't forget to subscribe, tap the notification bell, and share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Because sometimes, the most powerful stories are the ones that remind us that even in our darkest moments, we can rise stronger than ever.